Um, the name of this article is How the West Debt Trapped Ghana. Okay. Ghana's relationship with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has been a contentious one, marked by repeated bailouts and stringent austerity measures. Since gaining their independence, Ghana has sought IMF assistance 17 times, with the most recent $3 billion loan approved in May 2023. This pattern has led to lots of questions on whether the IMF interventions are truly helping the country or trapping it in a cycle of debt and economic hardship. Now, as we've discussed before on this very program, that the IMF has done this to countless countries, including the Ukraine and Argentina. And their goal is to essentially force smaller countries into privatization, where they have to then let American companies come in and manage things like their mining operations or their water supply, things like this. Anything that the United States feels like it could be economically interested in. So this is no different. Ghana is just another example of the IMF using what some have been calling neo-colonialism by, instead of brute force and cutting off the hands of children, we're using a fountain pen and contracts and a sophisticated way of loaning money and then overthrowing governments in order to get by. The IMF's involvement in Ghana has consistently come with strict conditionalities, often requiring the government to implement severe austerity measures. So this is another key characteristic of the IMF loans, is that they force these smaller countries into austerity by making them, forcing them basically to cut programs. These usually include significant cuts to government spending, including crucial social sectors such as healthcare, education. The introduction of user fees for the essential services has further burdened the population, making it a basic necessity uh, that's less accessible to those who are already struggling. So, one of the most devastating impacts of the austerity measures has been on Ghana's healthcare system. Despite the African Union's recommendation that countries allocate 15% of their national budgets to healthcare, Ghana's expenditure in this sector remains woefully inadequate. The constraints on hiring healthcare workers, including nurses, and the lack of proper laboratory facilities in major public hospitals have severely compromised the quality of healthcare available to Ghanaians. That's that's typical with these countries who play ball in globalization and capitalism. Eventually, you're going to um, end up cutting spending to pay, you know, mm, frivolous debts. Let's say some of the things that we do, to the interest that we charge, is another thing we're going to talk about, because uh, we charge more interests than, say, China, who gives out loans to foreign countries, but does it with a different sort of approach, which they look for infrastructure projects, or tell us what you want to build and we'll give you money. That's how China does it. And America does it. Well, here's a bunch of money, do whatever you want with it. And a lot of that gets siphoned out of the country from corrupt leaders in African countries and in Central America, stuff like that, anywhere in the world, really. Um, so the economic consequences of IMF policies in Ghana have been pretty far reaching. While the programs promise economic stability, the reality has often been suppressed economic growth, entrenched poverty, and inequality, as is the case with these kind of endeavors. It's not the point to enrich the country, it's the point to enrich a few very wealthy people in the country, and then the rest of those resources go somewhere else. Look, the banana republics of 1954 in Guatemala, that where we owned the fruit companies down there, and then de facto owned the entire country. Uh, this is something that hasn't changed. The cycle of debt and dependence. So this is really typical of IMF loans. They all get into situations where they take out multiple loans to pay for each other. They'll take out a high interest loan to pay back a low interest loan, and vice versa. And there's a lot of questions people are asking about the effectiveness of the fund's approach, of course. Critics argue that the focus on short-term fiscal targets and rigid economic policies fails to address the underlying structural issues in the economy. It perpetuates a cycle of borrowing and austerity that keeps the country trapped in economic instability. Exactly right. As Ghana continues to grapple with all these things, there are growing calls for reevaluation in the approach to economic recovery. A lot of experts advocate for more flexible and content-specific economic policies, but to be fair, it's only going to end up one way. Some larger country with a larger military will dictate what happens in a country that has no military and has no infrastructure. They'll always sort of be, until some, benevolent force comes in and says, we will build you a power plant. No, don't worry about it. We just want to help you guys. We're tired of seeing you taking a crap in a bucket, let us help you. So China versus Western institutions. Ghana's relationship with the IMF has been long and complex, to say the least. Like I said before, since 1966, Ghana has got a pretty amazing 17 different loans. So clearly dependent on the IMF. They overthrew the Prime Minister, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. He's a hero to a lot of leftists out there because he represents somebody who stood up to Western imperialism, and he did cozy up with, I think, Soviet interests. The IMF's lending practices in Ghana have been characterized by strict conditionalities. Always. It's about privatization, currency devaluation, and forced austerity, taking state-owned enterprises and making economic reforms that turn around and privatize a company and allows a corporation to come in and sink its teeth into it. Famously in 1980, when, in the 80s, when Thatcher came in, they privatized the water. Well, a lot of rich people got rich, but the water, when it turned from public to private, had 3 times as much toxic waste and cost about 3 times as much. So it wasn't privatization is only good for the very few. The 2015 program, the Ghanaian government was required to limit hiring and wage increases to the public sector and eliminate subsidies for stuff like utilities and petroleum products, and implement new revenue sources and taxes on luxury cars and high earners. So basically, when Ghana owes money to Western institutions, these institutions say, we can come in and we can tell you how to run your country as a sovereign nation in order to get our money back. It's a mafioso kind of deal. The country has been experiencing, of course, multiple episodes of economic instability, including high inflation, currency depreciation, and widening budget deficits. And in 2015, the economy was in trouble. There was rampant inflation and this depreciating currency, despite the previous IMF programs. So you'd think after years and years, almost 100 years, at least 50 years of loans aimed at making a country better, blah, 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 and nothing good is happening. And now we're just getting into these worse and worse cycles of debt. Something's clearly wrong. The structural adjustment programs, the SAPs, mandated by the IMF in the 1980s and 1990s, were also pretty bad. They had severe social costs. They had programs that led to reduced government spending on critical sectors like education and healthcare. So they forced them to cut out their most important things. And a lot of people will say, well, if you can't pay your debts, don't take on debts or whatever. But this is not taking into account predatory lending on one hand, but on the other hand, it only takes one administration in a government in one of these countries to say, yeah, okay, I'm President so and so, Joe Blow from this country in Africa. I'll just sign away some of our rights to we can get loans from the IMF. And naturally what happens is they buddy up with the US, or if they refuse to pay their loans, suddenly they get overthrown. Kind of crazy, tends to work. The SAPs aimed at stabilizing the country economy, increase poverty across the boards. The high interest rates associated with Western lending institutions in general, including the IMF, have pretty much exacerbated what's going on in Ghana as far as poverty. Western private lenders have been reported to charge Ghana interest rates that are double those of Chinese lenders, with an average of 5% compared to 2.7% for Chinese loans. This higher cost of borrowing has contributed to Ghana's debt burden, and it's limited its fiscal space for development initiatives. So, like I said before, China is lending and buddying up and cozying up with African countries. There's no doubt about it, but how they're approaching it, it's more sustainable because it's good. It's better for both parties. China keeps saying it's betting on a cooperative future, and so far they've done pretty good. Now they are aggressive and they're in the region and they are seeking proprietary information, but we need to be focusing on us, not them anyway. And besides, they're beating us. That's all that matters. So the IMF's approach in Ghana has also been criticized for its one-size-fits-all policy. These economic prescriptions, which they fail to account for a country-specific economic and social context. They don't care too much about the cultural ins and outs of a country, and which could have a great, impact on the budget. The push for privatization and state-owned enterprises is a common IMF condition, has not always led to promised efficiency gains, and has sometimes resulted in job losses and increased costs for essential services. So again, another instance where what was promised actually ends up backfiring. In contrast, Chinese lending to Ghana has generally shown more flexibility and a focus to specific infrastructure projects with fewer policy conditions attached. Obviously, this approach is viewed more favorably by some officials there and economists. It allows for more targeted investments in areas need critical need. Generally, on paper, sounds like a better deal. But not to discount corruption in politics there, which is a huge part of the puzzle when you put it together, seeing what the IMF does, what the United States military-industrial complex does, and economic interests we have mixed with the right kind of corrupt foreign politician. So their history, there's poverty, imperialism, colonialism are deeply intertwined with the actions and decisions of the leaders there. So starting with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. He was Ghana's first prime minister and president. He initially led the country to independence in 1957 with a vision of a Pan-Africa. And he dreamed of economic self-reliance. However, his ambitions, developed projects, and increasing alignment with the Soviet Union led to economic challenges. In 1966, Nkrumah was overthrown by the National Liberation Council, marking Ghana's first engagement with the IMF. And a lot of the economic challenges that it was facing was induced by the United States, as we went around the country at the time, overthrowing governments of people we thought to be communists. And there's a great book that just came out called The Jakarta Method a few years ago, and it highlights how the United States systematically went and killed, with the help of a military dictatorship in Indonesia, about 500,000 people, something like this. And it became the playbook that they used to overthrow communist governments. And to this day, there's traces of these kind of political games going on now in the Caspian and in the Balkans, everywhere. We're constantly trying to peddle influence. So the post-Nkrumah era saw a series of military coups and brief civilian governments, as it is when you have a country that you want to exploit the resources of. You want to keep them in disarray long enough to make off with all the money and give them a series of military dictatorships and stuff, keep them occupied and keep the people under strict orders. Worked in Spain for 30, 40 years, something like this. So this period from 1966 roughly to the 1980s was characterized by economic mismanagement and corruption, which further entrenched Ghana's dependence on external financial support. Good thing, just so happens to work. It's like a drug dealer. Keeps you hooked, ruins your life, and you come back for more because it's the only thing you can really do. Jerry Rawlings, who came to power through a military coup in 1981, initially rejected IMF involvement. However, facing severe economic crisis, he eventually embraced IMF-backed structural adjustment programs in 1983. These reforms, while stabilizing the economy, also led to significant social costs, including reduced government spending on education and healthcare. So this is very typical of these Western institutions, to force the kids out of school and the sick out of the hospital. And then you have John Kufuor's presidency. That was 2001 to 2009. This saw Ghana entering a highly indebted poor countries initiative in 2003. So this decision was controversial and led to some debt relief and reducing the government debt from 66 billion to about 23 billion by 2006. But a lot of people argued that this debt relief came with more stringent conditions that limited Ghana's policy autonomy. And that's really the cut and dry of it. If we're talking about countries that are sovereign, and they should remain sovereign, and we shouldn't have contracts in international trade where one of us ends up in basically debtor's prison. Another leader they had in Ghana, John Mahama, he was in 2012 to 2017. There was a power crisis, led to another IMF bailout in 2015. It was a $918 million loan, and it came with conditions that aimed at faster growth and job creation, but of course with the typical austerity measures and social spending cuts. So, and this is really the way too, is you get these loans and they want you to do a certain thing as well. They say, look, Argentina, you're really good at growing wheat and raising cattle, so why don't you just focus on that and don't worry about, feeding your people or anything else. You'll just import everything. And so what happens is people get, we get stuck on imports. And when you're stuck on imports, as soon as the steak market tanks or the grain market tanks, and that's all you have, then all of a sudden you're at the whims of the West yet again, the puppeteer of the globalized economy. They'll sell you whatever you need at a price that you probably can't afford. Most countries should nowadays be balancing what you're making and what you're exporting, it's more important that you're self-sustaining, that you're not treating your country like a cash crop, that you're just going to ruin the whole thing and do a scorched earth kind of like whatever. This is typical neoliberal globalization thinking. And it has to end. We have to bring back some amount of self-reliance to governments. Anyway, so all these people, the current administration, I believe, is Nana Akufo-Addo, and he has also asked for IMF assistance with $3 billion loan approved in 2023. We're still debating on the conditionalities of the IMF and whether or not they're fair. The IMF programs have often been provided short-term economic stability, but the outgoing and ongoing sort of debt cycles, when people keep coming back and nothing ever actually gets fixed, it raises questions on whether or not it's really working. And I frankly don't have the data to say how much IMF has made off of loans made to countries like this. I don't know where that data is. If somebody has it, let me know. So here's a few statistics for you, okay, guys? Ghana's poverty rate in 2016 was 78.50%. That was a 2% decline from 2012. Not great. The number of people living in extreme poverty in Ghana is projected to be 6,700,000 by 2025. Okay. Ghana scored 43 points out of 100 on the Corruption Perceptions Index. So a bit lawless. Ghana ranks 70th on the least corrupt nation out of 180 countries. So there you go, in the middle. Nice, healthy middle there. Economic growth in Ghana is projected to slow down 1.5 in 2023 and 2024. Well, these are old statistics. Poverty rates in Ghana are projected to peak at 31.5. Nearly 850,000 Ghanaians are pushed into poverty due to rising prices and loss of purchasing power. More than 17 million bribes were paid in Ghana in 2021. And Ghana's poverty rate was cut in half between 1991 and 2012 by 50%. So it does fluctuate. Fascinating country, for sure. But to fully understand the relationship between the IMF and the US and Europeans and colonialism and imperialism, we got to talk about the history. So Ghana was known as the Gold Coast. Okay, it first encountered European powers in the late 15th century when Portuguese traders arrived in 1471. The Portuguese established their first permanent trading post, São João da Mina. They later renamed it Elmina Castle. In 1492, to protect their gold, ivory, and pepper trade interests. That was the beginning of the colonization of the region by Europeans. So over the following centuries, other European powers, including the Dutch, Brits, Danes, and Swedes, joined the Portuguese in establishing trading posts and forts along the Ghanaian coast. By the 17th century, the coastline was dotted with more than 30 European fortifications, creating the highest concentration of European military architecture outside of Europe. British colonialization, of Ghana intensified in the 19th century. In 1874, Britain proclaimed the coastal areas as a crown colony, and by 1902, they had established control over the Ashanti region and the Northern Territories. The colonial administration implemented various measures, including indirect rule, Western education, and exploitation of natural resources, particularly the gold and cocoa. So the impact of colonialism on Ghana was pretty profound, and it led to the erosion of traditional governance structures and created new ethnic and religious divisions. As is typical, you look at what's going on in any African country like Rwanda, where they really have deep-seated hatreds towards each other, but I'm sure it could all be solved with a little bit of material condition change. The U.S. involvement in Ghana intensified after World War II. A Cold War began to shape global politics. The United States viewed Ghana, which gained independence in 1957, under Kwame Nkrumah, as maybe an ally in preventing Soviet influence in Africa. And initially, U.S.-Ghana relationships were positive. Vice President Richard Nixon leading the American delegation to Ghana's independence celebrations. But relations soured quickly when Nkrumah pursued policies that clashed with U.S. interests. He aligned with the Soviet Union, was criticized by West, and he himself criticized Western capitalism, which strained relationships with the West. The publication of Nkrumah's book, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, further heightened tensions, which anybody out there who has that book, check it out. That's a good read. The deteriorating relationship between Ghana and the U.S. culminated in the 1966 coup that overthrew Nkrumah. While there's no concrete proof of direct U.S. involvement, declassified documents and historical analysis suggest the U.S. may have played a role in Nkrumah's downfall. And this is absolutely, positively the pattern that we're seeing when we have other evidence that this exact thing happened to other countries in the same way. And then this happened. If it walks like a duck, if it talks like a duck. So the IMF, it's another way that the West keeps the love of imperialism alive, which I don't know. I'm not a fan. It doesn't seem like a good way to treat other people, other places, and not even the strategic implication saying that this isn't even a sustainable thing because eventually they're going to come after you. You'll never be able to turn your back. There's nothing wrong with being strong, but don't be aggressive. I don't know why we can't do that, but I guess